Hello once again. Today we're going to learn how to handle collisions in OpenSearch. We will learn what colliders are and how to use them to detect collisions. So what's a collider? It's basically a geometric shape in the game world that is used to detect collisions between itself and other colliders. What you see now in the video is an example of gameplay. Colliders are being displayed on top of many entities. Take a look at the yellow circles and rectangles all around. These are all colliders. Do you see that yellow rectangle around Surge? That is the collider of the player. That particular collider will play a very important role in our boss fight. We're gonna use it to detect collisions between the player and the boss. Okay, so back to scripting. In order to make our boss responsive to collisions, we need to add a collider to it. At the present date, we can use a box, a ball, or a combination of these shapes as colliders. Since our B fits nicely within a circle, we're gonna use a ball as the collider of the boss. So let's import the collision ball component into the script and add this to the boss. When creating a collision ball, you need to specify what is the radius of the circle. A radius of 30 pixels looks good enough. You can find this number by trial and error or simply by looking at the sprite. Okay, now the boss has a collider. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm making this collider visible by writing collider.visible equals true. You can always take a look at the SurgeScript documentation to explore this and many other properties of the components. The link is in the description below. Now let's save the file and check that out. So you can see that there is a yellow ball being displayed on top of the B. That ball is the collider. As you can see, it's not aligned to the B. That is because the center of the ball is aligned to the hotspot of the B. If you don't know what the hotspot is, I suggest you take a look at my other video creating baddies in OpenSearch. The hotspot is basically a point that anchors the sprite. In any case, we're gonna fix the alignment later. Now we're gonna learn how to detect a collision. So how do we do that? Well, there are two basic events you can capture: a collision and an overlap. The difference between the two is that a collision event happens as soon as two colliders touch each other. The overlap event happens while the colliders touch each other. Let's demonstrate. In order to detect a collision, we write a function called onCollision. That function receives one argument, the other collider. The code of this function will be executed as soon as the collider of the boss collides with some other collider. So let's just print a message to the screen. Save the file and launch the engine. Do you see the collision taking place? Remember that the player has a collider of its own. As soon as the two colliders touch each other, we print a message to the screen. If you're curious, by the way, you can press M in the level editor to display all colliders as well as the collision masks of the bricks. Okay, now let's erase that print and write a function to capture an overlap of colliders. The name of the function is onOverlap. Again, it receives another collider as an argument. I'll print a message to the screen. Let's save the file and see what happens. Now, do you see that the message is being printed several times to the screen? That's because the two colliders are overlapping each other for a certain time. We print the message as long as they overlap. Okay, now that we have seen the difference between a collision and an overlap, we're going to erase the overlap function. Let's stick to the collision. Function onCollision will be called as soon as the collider of the boss collides with any other collider. It turns out that we are only interested in the collision between the boss and the player. How do we know if that is actually the case? Well, we need to check the entity of the colliders. Colliders are attached to entities. The entity attached to the collider of the boss is the bee. Likewise, the entity attached to the collider of the player is the player itself. When we write other collider.entity, we get the entity that is attached to the other collider. Let's store that entity in a variable called entity. Now, how do we know if the entity attached to the other collider is actually the player? We simply check if it has a player tag. If the entity is tagged player, we can be sure that this collision is taking place between the boss and the player. So now let's store the entity in a variable called player. And let's print a message. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover today. We have learned what colliders are and how to use them to detect collisions. We have also seen the difference between a collision and an overlap. In addition to that, we now know how to check if the collision is happening between the boss and the player. Later on, we'll learn how to adjust the alignment between the collider and the bee. See you next time!